Oh no, your titanium card is out of money.
I'll pay for that bottle of water.
Billionaire Sheikh's card got declined. What the maid's daughter did next stunned everyone. The grocery store was too quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing their pale glow across the scuffed linoleum floors. A line of customers stretched back to the door, carts squeaking, children whining, coins clinking against the counter, and at the very front stood Sheikh Tariq Alja, a man whose signature could shift global markets, fumbling with a black titanium credit card that refused to work. Beep. The cashier's voice was flat. Declined. The word struck like a whip. Tariq's broad shoulders stiffened beneath his tailored desert brown coat. He tried again. Another sharp electronic beep. Declined. The silence broke into laughter. A teenage boy in the back scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. What kind of billionaire can't even buy water? A ripple of chuckles spread through the line. Some whispered, others shook their heads with mock pity. The cashier sighed, set the bottle of mineral water aside, and looked to the next customer. To the crowd, he was no longer a sheikh, no longer the desert king who once owned palaces of glass and steel. Here, under buzzing lights and judgmental eyes, he was just a man too poor to pay for water. Tariq's jaw clenched. He had endured betrayal in boardrooms, mockery from rivals, but this small humiliation burned deeper. For once, his wealth meant nothing. For once, the world looked at him and saw failure. And then from below, a child's voice pierced the tension. I can pay for it. Heads turned. At Tariq's side stood a girl no older than 10. Her hair was tangled, the color of sunlit straw, her eyes a bright summer sky blue. In her tiny hands, she held out a battered leather wallet. She dug into it with clumsy fingers and produced 2 crumpled dollar bills. My name's Abigail, she said softly, but Mommy calls me Abby. She says, we should always help people when they need it. That's what heroes do. The store went silent. Even the teenager who had mocked him lowered his gaze. Tariq looked down at her, this fragile child offering him dignity the world had stripped away, and for the first time in years, the fortress around his heart cracked. He took the bottle, bowed his head slightly, and whispered, Thank you, little one. And in that instant, the story of a billionaire's downfall shifted because of a child's simple act of kindness. The following morning, sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Tariq Alja's penthouse, a palace of steel and marble towering above the city skyline. The world below buzzed with ordinary lives, commuters, school buses, cafe chatter, while inside, silence pressed heavy against the immaculate walls. Tariq sat at the edge of a vast dining table carved from dark oak. 12 chairs lined each side, yet he ate alone. A plate of fruit untouched, a silver carafe of coffee cooling by the minute. He stared across the cityscape, his reflection staring back in the glass, sharp-eyed and expressionless. At 45, Sheikh Tariq was a man carved from discipline and storms. His tall frame still carried the strength of desert cavalry bloodlines. A neatly trimmed black beard framed his face, concealing the weariness around his mouth. His eyes, steel gray with a glint of gold, were both commanding and haunting, the eyes of a man who had fought to the top and found no joy there. The newspapers were unkind that morning. Billionaire humiliated, declined card, declined pride. Desert king or pauper pretender? The blurry photograph of him at the grocery store was splashed across every screen. To the public, it was a delicious irony. The richest man alive brought low in the most ordinary place imaginable. But Tarek had been raised to endure mockery. This was not the first time the world had tried to strip him of dignity. Still, beneath his stoic silence, something in him shifted. He remembered the little girl, Abby, her hands trembling yet steady, holding out 2 crumpled bills. A child had given him what billions could not: grace. At that very moment, in a modest apartment across town, Abby's mother, Susan Miller, was packing her daughter's school lunch. A widow in her late 30s, Susan worked as a housemaid in Tarek's estate. Her brown hair was pulled into a bun, strands escaping to frame her tired but gentle face. Life had lined her eyes with fatigue, but not with bitterness. Susan was proud, though life gave her little reason to be. She never asked for charity. She taught Abby to hold her head high, to treat others with kindness regardless of their wealth or title. Her father, a decorated veteran, had taught her the same, and she passed it to her daughter as fiercely as she passed bread across the breakfast table. When she heard what Abby had done at the grocery store, Susan had been horrified. To her, the Sheikh was a distant, unreachable figure, a man whose world never brushed against hers except in the laundry rooms of his estate. She feared her daughter had embarrassed him, or worse, offended him. But Abby only smiled. "He looked sad, Mommy. Heroes help people when they look sad." Back in his penthouse, Tarek ignored the buzzing phone on the table. His chief of staff, Marcus Thorne, had left 6 missed calls. Marcus was younger, sharp-featured, with ambition burning in his veins. To Marcus, loyalty was a currency, spent only if profitable. He had been whispering to board members for months, watching for the first crack in Tarek's armor. Now, with humiliation plastered across headlines, Marcus saw his chance. The contrast could not be starker. Tarek's empire was a machine of glass and money where men like Marcus thrived, yet Abby and Susan lived in a world of cracked linoleum floors and second-hand furniture, humble, fragile, but real. That evening, Tarek found something unusual in the back seat of his Rolls-Royce. Nestled between leather seats was a stuffed rabbit, frayed at the ears, one button eye hanging by a thread. Abby's toy. She must have dropped it at the grocery store. He turned it over in his hands. The toy smelled faintly of lavender detergent. Something tightened in his chest, a sensation he had not felt in years, the tug of memory, of family, of something lost. For the first time in decades, Tarek didn't think of his empire. He thought of a child's courage, a mother's quiet dignity, and the possibility that all his wealth had blinded him to the only riches that mattered. Outside his penthouse windows, the city glittered with neon and steel. But inside, for the first time, Tarek Alja felt the hollowness of his kingdom, and he knew, whether he admitted it or not, that his life had already begun to change. The headlines didn't fade, they multiplied. By noon the following day, international networks had already picked up the grocery store story. On one screen, declined Sheikh, empire cracking. On another, from palaces to pennies. What's next for Tarek Alja? It wasn't just gossip. It was blood in the water. At the global headquarters of Alja Enterprises, a 40-story tower of steel and glass, Tarek sat silent at the head of a vast mahogany boardroom table. The air was sharp, with the scent of leather chairs and the faint tang of fear. Arrayed before him were 12 men and women in tailored suits. directors, shareholders, allies who had once sworn loyalty. But today, their eyes gleamed differently, cold, calculating, predatory. Public confidence is collapsing, one director said, sliding a dossier across the table. Our shares dipped 12% overnight. Investors are nervous, another added, her voice clipped. They question whether your judgment remains sound. Marcus Thorne leaned forward, hands folded neatly on the table. His tone was smooth, almost respectful, but Tarek caught the glint in his eyes. Perhaps, Sheikh, this is the moment to consider restructuring leadership for stability for the company. Restructuring leadership. The words hung in the air like a blade. The very empire Tarek had built, deal by deal, risk by risk, now shifted beneath him. And his own chief of staff, the man he had elevated, was quietly offering him the throne's exchange, abdicate or be pushed. A ripple of agreement passed around the table. One director cleared his throat. You've done remarkable work, Sheikh, but markets require perception, stability. We cannot afford weakness. Tarek said nothing. His silence filled the room like thunder waiting to break. But the directors mistook silence for surrender. They leaned in, emboldened. We propose you step back, Marcus pressed. Publicly, of course, it will be framed as a voluntary transition. Privately, it will reassure the board that the company is still in capable hands. The irony twisted like a knife. These were the same men and women who had once begged for his vision, who had cheered when his risks made them rich. Now, at the first scent of blood, they circled like wolves. Do you truly believe, Tarek said finally, voice low and measured, that this empire was built on stability? The room stilled. His words cut the air, but he did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply rose, his chair sliding back against the polished floor. His broad figure loomed in the boardroom light, casting a shadow across the table. Without another word, he left the room. Behind him, whispers erupted, betrayal, doubt, schemes unfolding in real time. Outside, the city pressed on, cars honking, screens flashing, skyscrapers gleaming. But inside Tarek's chest, silence roared. When he returned to his penthouse that night, he did not touch the untouched dinner tray waiting on the counter. He walked past the chandeliers, past the marble staircases, and stopped at his study. There, on the desk, still sat Abby's stuffed rabbit. His hand hovered over it. He remembered her voice at the grocery store, trembling but brave. That's what heroes do. The contrast was unbearable. In the boardroom, surrounded by men who would sell him for a percentage point, he had been treated as a liability. Yet a child, a stranger, had treated him as someone worth helping. He sank into the leather chair, the rabbit in his hands. For the first time in years, he let himself feel the weight of betrayal. But beneath that weight, a seed stirred. They thought him finished. They thought him humiliated, cornered, abandoned. They had forgotten who he was before the titles, before the billions. They had forgotten the boy who once walked barefoot through dust, who had clawed his way past mockery, who had built everything they now sought to steal. And as the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, Tarek's silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt like the pause before a storm. That night, the city outside his penthouse pulsed with neon life. Cars streamed like rivers of light, towers glowed like lighthouses of glass, and the world moved on as if nothing had changed. But inside his study, Sheikh Tarek Alja sat alone, the stuffed rabbit in his hands. The fabric was worn thin, patched clumsily on one side, a button eye dangled by a thread. He turned it over slowly, the way one might study a relic unearthed from a forgotten past. And like a crack opening in the dam of his mind, memory poured in. He was no prince. Once, long before the marble floors and private jets, he had been a boy running barefoot through dust. The village lay at the edge of the desert, a scatter of mud brick homes baked golden under the sun. His father had died when Tarek was only 8, leaving debts that swallowed their land. His mother, shoulders bent with grief, had taken in laundry from wealthier families just to keep bread on the table. The rich boys of the village used to laugh at him. They called him Goat Boy, mocked his torn clothes, shoved him when he walked by. Tarek learned to keep his eyes low, fists clenched, shame burning in his chest. But his grandfather, Hassan Alja, was different. A soldier once, his back scarred from battles long forgotten, Hassan carried himself with quiet dignity. Each night, he would sit with Tarek beneath the stars, their sandals digging into cool sand, and speak in a voice rough as stone. "Strength isn't gold, boy," he would say, staring out at the dunes. "Strength is keeping your head high when they want you to bow." Tarek listened. At first, he didn't understand. But then came the day when one of the rich boys knocked a clay jug from his hands, shattering it on the stones. Tarek wanted to cry. He wanted to run. But he remembered his grandfather's words. So instead, he stood straight, eyes steady, and walked away without bowing. That night, Hassan clasped his shoulder. "Now you understand. Dignity is the one treasure no man can take unless you hand it to him." Those words seared into Tarek's heart. As he grew older, Hassan taught him more: how to read contracts when most villagers could not, how to count coins quickly, how to see opportunity where others only saw despair. Tarek worked at the marketplace, carrying sacks, sweeping the floors, saving every coin. At 14, he bought his first goat. At 15, he bought 3 more. He remembered the nights when he and his grandfather sat by the fire, the old man's hands trembling, but his voice firm. "Do not chase wealth for its own sake, boy. Chase it to protect those who cannot protect themselves." But tragedy came early. When Tarek was 17, his grandfather's heart gave out. The old soldier collapsed in the field, and no doctor came fast enough. Tarek buried him with his own hands, the sand hot and merciless, the tears burning tracks down his cheeks. He swore an oath at that grave. "I will rise. I will build a life so powerful no one can ever laugh at us again. No one will call me Goat Boy." And he did. He clawed his way into city markets, struck deals that wiser men called impossible, took risks that should have destroyed him but somehow paid off. By 25, he controlled shipping lines. By 30, he held oil fields. By 35, skyscrapers bore his name, but somewhere along the way, the vow had shifted. What began as a promise to protect had hardened into a hunger to dominate. He forgot the lesson of dignity, replacing it with the lesson of conquest. He became the king his rivals feared, but not the man his grandfather would have recognized. Now, decades later, in a penthouse of glass, Tarek felt the weight of that forgotten vow pressing on him. It wasn't the wealth that haunted him. It wasn't even the betrayal of Marcus or the mockery of rivals. It was the realization that in the middle of a grocery store, it had taken a little girl with tangled hair and crumpled bills to remind him of the lesson Hassan Alja had once burned into his soul. Strength isn't gold. Strength is dignity. He pressed the rabbit to his chest, eyes closing against the flood of memory. His empire could collapse tomorrow. His name could be dragged through mud. But if he found a way to reclaim the one thing he had lost, the one treasure Hassan had spoken of, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could be more than a fallen king. Perhaps he could be a man again. The city lights blurred beyond the glass, and Tarek whispered into the silence, "Grandfather, I remember now." And with that memory, the storm inside him finally began to move. The boardroom was waiting for him. For 2 days, Tarek had ignored calls, messages, urgent memos marked in red. The directors whispered that he had broken, that humiliation had finished the mighty Sheikh. Marcus Thorne, confident in his victory, had already begun drafting statements for leadership transition. But on the third morning, when the elevator doors opened and Tarek stepped into the boardroom, silence swept the table. He wore no tailored suit, no jeweled cufflinks. Instead, a plain dark coat draped his broad shoulders, its collar turned down, its fabric unremarkable. Yet somehow, he filled the room with a presence heavier than marble. The directors shuffled. Marcus forced a smile. "Sheikh, we didn't expect you this early." Tarek set a single folder on the table. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying across the polished surface with the weight of stone. "I will not sell the Henderson farm." A ripple of confusion spread. One director cleared his throat. "With respect, Sheikh, that property was essential to—" Tarek raised a hand. The gesture silenced him. "I will not buy their land. I will invest in it. New irrigation systems, organic certification, shared profits. They keep their soil, and I gain what I need. A place for a community fund, where the children of this town can learn dignity through work." Gasps, mutters, shocked glances exchanged. Marcus's voice cut through the noise, sharp with disbelief. "You're abandoning millions, billions even. Do you realize how this looks? Investors will call you weak." Tarek turned his gaze to him. His eyes, gray with a glint of gold, were colder than any winter storm. "Weakness," Tarek said, "is forgetting why we fight in the first place." The words dropped into the silence like iron. For years, Marcus had only known Tarek as a master of profit, a strategist who wielded billions like weapons. But this man standing before him now was different, calm, unyielding, anchored by something Marcus couldn't measure. A director shifted nervously. "Sheikh, this is madness. The press already questions your stability. If you go through with this, they'll devour you alive." Tarek leaned forward, his hands braced on the table. "Let them. I have faced deserts that wanted me dead. I have buried men stronger than all of you. I did not rise from dust to trade dignity for numbers on a page." The room fell silent again. Even Marcus had no reply. And for the first time in months, Tarek felt the fire of his grandfather's words burning in his chest, steadying him. He closed the folder, straightened, and walked to the door. At the threshold, he paused. His voice, quiet yet final, carried back across the stunned boardroom. "This is not the end of me, it is the beginning." Then he left, leaving only silence and the faint echo of a storm building behind him. The storm came in the form of Richard Sterling. If Tarek Alja was the king of deserts, Sterling was the wolf of Wall Street, silver-haired, sharp-suited, and hungry. Where Tarek built, Sterling devoured. Where Tarek once inspired awe, Sterling inspired only fear. And now he had come to finish what humiliation had started. In the small-town courthouse, cameras lined the steps, reporters jostling for space. Headlines screamed, "Battle of the Titans, Alja versus Sterling." But the whispers were cruel. "The Sheikh is finished. Sterling will bury him." Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and dust. The Henderson family sat nervously on one side, father, mother, two children clutching hands. Their farm was their life, their legacy, the last piece of land Sterling wanted to seize and pave into a distribution empire. Sterling strode in with a smirk, his entourage of lawyers in immaculate gray suits. "Let's make this quick," he muttered, loud enough for Tarek to hear. "Some of us still have companies to run." Tarek entered moments later. No entourage, no silk tie, just himself, broad-shouldered in a plain, dark coat, eyes calm but burning. Susan and Abby sat quietly in the benches behind him. Abby clutched her stuffed rabbit, patched at the ear, her blue eyes never leaving him. The trial began. Sterling's lawyers droned on about contracts, about inevitability, about progress. They waved thick stacks of papers and spoke of billions in potential profit. To them, Henderson land was not soil or heritage. It was an asset waiting to be carved up. Then it was Tarek's turn. He stood slowly, every motion deliberate. For a moment, he said nothing. The courtroom held its breath. Cameras zoomed in, pens poised over notepads. Finally, his voice rang out, low, steady, carrying to the back of the room. "Do you know what it feels like," he began, "to stand in line at a grocery store with nothing but a bottle of water in your hand and to be told you cannot afford it?" A murmur ran through the room. Sterling's smirk faltered. Tarek continued, eyes fixed not on the judge, not on Sterling, but on the Henderson children in the gallery. "I was born with nothing, dust on my feet, laughter in my ears. They called me Goat Boy. They told me I would never own anything worth a coin. And yet, I built empires, not because I wanted riches, but because I wanted dignity. Because a man once told me that strength is not measured in gold, but in how high you hold your head when others want you to bow." He paused. The silence was heavy, reverent. "Last week, my card was declined. The world laughed. The board betrayed me. But a child," he turned, gesturing toward Abby, "a child offered me 2 crumpled dollars, not out of pity, out of courage, out of dignity." Abby shrank slightly under the attention, clutching her rabbit. Susan's eyes brimmed with tears. Tarek faced the judge now, his voice sharpened, cutting like desert wind. "These men speak of contracts, of profit, of inevitability, but the law is not meant to be a blade for the powerful. The law is meant to protect dignity, and there is dignity in this soil, dignity in families who rise before dawn to work the land, dignity in children who learn that life is more than steel and numbers." He reached into his folder and laid a faded document on the judge's bench. "This," he said, "is the town charter signed a century ago. It forbids industrial development on family farmland. Forgotten, buried, but still binding. Sterling's empire cannot touch Henderson soil. Not legally, not morally." Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. Sterling's face darkened, his jaw tight with fury. He rose, voice booming, "This is sentimentality. Business cannot bow to children's stories." Tarek turned to him, eyes steady as stone. "No, Sterling, business without dignity is not business. It is theft." The words hit harder than any gavel. The room erupted, reporters scribbling furiously, whispers spreading like wildfire. The judge called for order, but his face betrayed something rare. He was moved. After deliberation, the ruling came swift. An injunction. The Henderson farm was safe, for now. Sterling's contracts, his threats, his billions, all halted by a single forgotten clause and the testimony of a man the world had mocked as finished. Sterling's hands trembled as he gathered his papers. His smirk was gone. His empire had suffered its first crack. But Tarek did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply turned, met Abby's wide blue eyes, and gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "This is what heroes do." The cameras flashed, immortalizing the moment. The billionaire, once humiliated in a grocery store, now standing tall in a courtroom, not because of wealth, but because of dignity reclaimed. And outside, as the crowd swarmed the courthouse steps, the whispers had changed. Not "the Sheikh is finished," but "the Sheikh has returned." Richard Sterling had built his reputation on one thing: inevitability. Deals closed because he said they would. Rivals folded because he promised they would. For years, people believed no one could stop him. But that belief shattered the moment the judge's gavel fell. By evening, news outlets around the world carried the same headline: Sterling blocked, Alia Saida's forgotten law, courtsides with farmers. The shock was immediate. Investors who had once worshipped Sterling's ruthlessness suddenly saw only liability. His stock plummeted overnight. Partners withdrew support, afraid of being tainted by the scandal. Even his most loyal allies abandoned him, their loyalty revealed for what it always was: greed in disguise. In the boardrooms where Sterling had once been treated like a king, whispers turned to laughter. His arrogance, once feared, now looked pitiful. His carefully constructed mask cracked, and beneath it stood not a titan, but a desperate man grasping at vanishing power. A week later, Sterling reappeared in the same courthouse, this time alone. No entourage, no lawyers in sharp suits, just a man with trembling hands clutching a single sheet of paper. He had agreed to sell his claim on the Henderson land for a symbolic $1. When the document was signed, he didn't look at Tarek. He couldn't. His voice faltered, his pride in tatters. The Wolf of Wall Street had been declawed, undone not by a hostile takeover, not by billions in leverage, but by an idea, by dignity and loyalty that no money could buy. Tarek, standing tall beside Susan and Abby, did not gloat. He did not mock Sterling the way Sterling had mocked him. Instead, he offered a simple nod, an acknowledgement that even enemies deserved a final ounce of grace. The crowd outside cheered, but Tarek only felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through truth. And in that moment, the world saw the difference between the two men. Sterling had chased power to dominate. Tarek, once humbled, had rediscovered power to protect. It was the true reversal. The arrogant man who thought himself untouchable had fallen, while the humiliated man who had seemed broken now stood as a figure of respect. For Sterling, it was the end. For Tarek, it was only the beginning. 6 months later, the Henderson farm looked nothing like the land Sterling had tried to seize. Fields of golden wheat bent gently in the wind, irrigation channels gleamed with fresh water, and children's laughter rang across the meadows. A wooden sign stood at the gate, painted by hand: Legacy Farms, where dignity grows. Tarek lived there now, not in glass towers, but in a farmhouse with creaking floors and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Each morning, he rose before dawn, walked the rows of crops, and felt a quiet peace the desert palaces had never given him. Susan Miller had found new life, too. She no longer scrubbed marble halls for strangers. She managed the farm's community kitchen, where neighbors gathered to share food and stories. The lines of fatigue on her face had softened into warmth, and when she looked at Tarek, it was no longer with fear of a master, but with the trust of a partner. And Abby, bright-eyed Abby, ran through the fields with her patched, stuffed rabbit in hand, chasing chickens, laughing with other children. She often sat beside Tarek on the porch, asking endless questions about business, about courage, about what it meant to be strong. He answered everyone, patient, steady, knowing that her small voice had saved him from himself. One crisp autumn morning, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a single stock certificate, one share of a newly formed national cooperative dedicated to protecting family farms. No letter, no signature, just a silent acknowledgement from the world he had left behind. Even the ruthless had noticed. Even the old empire he had abandoned could not ignore what he had built. Tarek placed the certificate on the mantel above the fireplace, beside Abby's rabbit. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, Tarek stood on the porch, hands resting on the wooden rail. Abby tugged at his sleeve, her blue eyes wide. "Do you think we're rich now?" she asked. Tarek looked out at the fields, at the farmhouse glowing with lamplight, at Susan humming softly in the kitchen. He smiled faintly, a real smile, rare and unforced. "Yes, Abby," he said, "richer than I ever was." The wind stirred the wheat. The night settled soft and quiet, and the man who had once been mocked in a grocery store, who had been stripped of empire and crown, now stood taller than he ever had, because he had rediscovered the one wealth that endures: dignity, love, and the legacy of a child's kindness.